All right, so here we are in Portland, Oregon. I've invited Richard Powers, Brenda Russell, and Damon Stone to have a little bit of a talk about the nature of dance and language and translation and how things get handed down from past to present and what those relationships are. And as I thought about the question, I was trying to think about what I see each of you as doing in some way, and I see you each doing it in very, very different ways, sort of looking at this question. So for people who don't know, Richard Powers is a dance historian at Stanford University and also a social dance teacher, travels the world and has deeply influenced many different communities. Brenda Russell travels the world and teaches dance and health and wellness and has gotten into all sorts of various things and has been a large voice in jazz and blues communities, I'd say. The social vernacular scene. Anything to add to that? No? And Damon Stone has been a very important voice in mostly in the blues world and speaking and teaching all around the world. And we have three very interesting voices with us at the table today. And so I'm hoping to hear some interesting conversation. So the question, I'm just going to start it with an opening question and we're just going to freeform it and feel free to just talk and go how we go. But my opening question is, how is the past alive and transmitted or communicated in social vernacular idiomatic dances?
That's a great question.
I think in a blues, a lot of it begins with the music. I think that is the bridge for many people from the past. That's often where the interest is germinated. I've got to dance to this. I have to move with that. Everyone's different, of course. Some crossover from something they're already doing, Lindy Hop or whatever. But I think for many people, it begins with the music.
It used to be passed down from body to body, and definitely in the modern culture that's changed. It's like the young people picking up the music from the past, and then now they're trying to figure out how to move to it, but they didn't get it from the body being passed down.
Right.
So it's a really tricky kind of time we're in because of that.
Yeah, the idea of people discovering that a dance exists, not through the love of its music and seeing it and wanting to be part of that thing that they see, is very foreign to me. A friend of mine posted this question on Facebook of, did you always love the music that goes with the dance that you do? And I was just shocked by the question itself, like the idea that you would do a dance that you didn't love the music from day one just seems so foreign to me because, I grew up listening to music and, by the time that I was capable of doing, waddling across the floor, it was always like, go dance, go dance. The adults, the elders in my family, would cheer me on as, a toddler to go out there and, do whatever it was that toddlers do to music when they hear it. And it's just, I grew up listening to all of the music that goes with the dances that I do. And that I do professionally at least, and the ones that I have come to later in life, there were still music that I'd been exposed to through other avenues of life, and that was like, oh, this is really cool, and finding out that, oh, there's like a whole like dance thing that goes with it. And like, well, the idea that this music moves me internally and then not expressing that by moving externally just seems such a weird disconnect for me.
Yeah, but in the culture now you have people coming to dance because they're lacking touch and socialization and sensuality in their life.
Yeah. Which is also odd to me.
Yeah. And so then I have to ask everybody, okay, well, what kind of music do you like? And then also you need to check out the ambiance of the venues and the people who are there. So it's like three things kind of determine what dances, social dances that they're going to do if they connect with the community. Like one of my favorite dances is the Latin dances really speak to me. I love them. I have never developed the same intimate bonded relationships with people as I have in other communities.
Mm-hmm.
So that affects how often and where I do it.
Right.
But I really love the music and I really love the dance, but I don't always, just make friends instantly in that community.
Mm-hmm.
So that's another thing, is that people have to figure out, maybe they hate bars, but they like ballrooms,
Yeah.
other way around.
Yeah.
So it's tricky.
So what would you all say is the relationship between this idea of the music moving you, the social aspects of how people interrelate, the various ways dances are handed down or transmitted? Sometimes it almost seems to me like there's the people, or even the way we dance, that it's the way we learn, and then the way we sort of move through us. Do you all think there's a difference there? Do you think that's important? How do you think that comes into play in watching these movements of dance communities?
Well, the way people learn is kind of a problem for learning dance, because a lot of my students are academics and they think that they're going to learn dance the way they learned math or something, and it just doesn't work that way.
So from an academic, what's your
Well,
perspective?
I think you partially answered your own question, though, at the end, when you talked about the different people maybe approaching it this way or hearing it this way. So when I interview anyone who has fallen in love with a dance form, maybe tango, I love that every answer is different. This era of pluralism we've had especially since the 80s, we cannot answer that question of what is it that answers your question, because for every person, as Brenda said, it might be the community draws. I want to be with these people. It might be the music. It might be something moves me personally from inside, and we can come up with 10 more.
And what do you mean by the era of pluralism?
Until the 70s and 80s, there were fads. And then they split up, like the 50s, you had the mods versus the rockers. Okay, you had two. But when we had the 70s and 80s, all of a sudden we had 10 or 15 different kind of music forms, for instance. And then along came the internet. And now this, if you want to call it niches or specialization, but it lets everyone find their own path easier. And so there is no more fad. I mean, clothes, what's today's hairstyle? How is this different from 10 years ago? It's all now no longer the thing to do for this reason altogether.
I see Brenda nodding. When you're mentioning fads in the 70s and 80s, Brenda's going, oh yeah.
Yeah, well, TV changed everything, and then the internet, continued to change it. Absolutely, there were more mainstream fads, and now we've got all these subcultures. That's why we have this word subculture, right?
Yeah.
Everybody's got their own little subculture and their thing that they're into and obsessed with, and like their whole life. It's like this whole world, and that's why somebody can be really famous in a subculture, but the rest of the world doesn't know who that person is. But to that subculture, they're like an idol.
I'm not sure I have a whole lot more to add to that. I think that that works for sort of like mainstream, we'll call it, American culture. But each ethnic group, depending on how much it is embraced into mainstream American culture, is going to have its own variation of that. If you look at the 60s and 70s, you have like, oh, okay, here is this set of things, but then you look at, Mexicans in the United States, you look at African Americans, and by that I mean Black people who parents, grandparents, great-grandparents born in the United States as opposed to immigrants from Africa. You look at, Chinese Americans, you look at Japanese Americans, they have their own specific thing within their culture that is just like that. And it may be a reflection of what's going on in the greater white American culture, or it may be a response to that. And sometimes it's just not at all related. and you can see that in music and style, fashion, pretty much every means of personal expression. You can find what that thing or the pair of things are in any like ethnic group. Like if you go to the 20s, black people were doing this sort of thing, and each community in different parts of the United States had their own variation of it, but it was still that, like, here's the primary way that the youth of that day were expressing themselves. And like Richard talked about, as television became a larger and larger thing in these communities, you started having expressions of similarity. Some of the geographic elements started to disappear as we become more and more inundated with things from one location over many different locations.
1957 American Bandstand.
Yeah.
All of a sudden that happened hugely.
Yeah.
What was 1957?
Oh, Dick Clark took his bandstand show from Philadelphia to ABC and said, let's make it national. And they said, okay, we'll try it for a week. And it broke all the records. And all of a sudden, what used to be, you did your high school style, became, what did the kids do in Philadelphia doing? And it hugely formed a genre as opposed to these micro individual evolutions of maybe a swing tradition at that time.
You see same thing in Black American history with Soul Train. It's like, here is like this show. Don Cornelius has got these kids doing this thing, and that becomes what everybody is doing. And it's no longer like I have my own variation of it, because we're all listening to swing music or we're all listening to blues music based on the musicians that live where you live and whichever ones happen to be traveling through your town or city. It becomes we are all looking to the same source. We may have like slightly different flavors of it, but it really started to create a coalescence. And then the internet, as Brenda mentioned, went boom. And so now you have this one thing that gets picked up and becomes super popular amongst a subset of people is sort of like a renewed regionalism, but it's of a cyber regionalism. It's like, I'm really into X, but specifically X3, not X1, not X2, not X4, X3, and it's just one thing, and there's a community around the world that is into that one thing, and there may be only 3 or 4 people in my small town that are into that one thing, but I identify with that thing. I dress, in whatever the appropriate dress code is for that niche, that subculture, and you have things that just go viral and like start skipping across these groups, and you get like these waves where mimetic transmission happens. Just its own like fascinating thing.
But that you mentioned that like somebody traveling through town, that people are now traveling all the time. So like when you only have 3 or 4 people in your town, you go. You jump on a plane and you go, but also like you don't live where you grew up. You don't necessarily live near your family. You might, like, our city has 111 people a day moving into it. And so you try to go to a yoga class that maybe was your favorite yoga class for 10 years, and now you can't even get in because there's so many new people, and they're like, the culture is changing so fast that it's all kind of lost and confused, and then everybody has their own little culture they're creating, but they have to go to like find it. So both we're all over the place, and then we're going all over the place, and then it just keeps perpetuating that going and going.
Do you think that so go ahead.
But back to Damon talking about the internet, it's been 15 minutes now and nobody's mentioned YouTube yet. And that's huge right there too.
Yeah. But we've lost the cultural, like I try to dance in my community. I try not to drive, I try to go like not everybody's living that way,
Yeah.
you
Right.
know? And so it's, even here in our local subculture blues community, there are people who come in from all around town and down from the college towns, you know, hour, 2 hours away sometimes, and they dance in this ballroom, and they get this idea that somehow this is what this cultural thing is, and it's their subculture. But you can just walk out the door and go to see the mainstream, you know, live music that's happening every day in dozens and dozens of bars all around town. And to me, there's like this whole life happening here in the city that these people don't know anything about. That's the part that's really bizarre to me, because you can still have a local culture and a local community, but people don't choose to.
Yeah, there's a definite sense of, and I don't mean this in a specifically negative way, but there's a definite sense of entitlement and an expectation of things being catered to me. And I say that because I don't mean it in this particular context as a bad thing, but here's the thing that I really like, and I like it a specific way, and I believe that I should be able to find that. And if I can't, then, you know, maybe I will go onto the internet and I will see if there's anybody who also thinks the way that I do, maybe in my town. And it's like, oh, okay, you really like, you know, this particular kind of synth pop music from the 80s, and you like it, and you like it, and I like it. You know, we could probably, you know, find some more people and like rent a space and just, you know, play the music we love and dance to it, as opposed to going, what are the local synth pop 80s new wave bands in the city? Because there's probably musicians who play that kind of thing, and they probably go somewhere not too far from you to play that music. And if you just voyage out, if you explore, you could find that thing and find a larger community. But instead, I want my thing my way when I want it. And so I may be growing up and, you know, creating a scene right next door to a vibrant community that I just never explored. And I see that with blues all the time.
Absolutely.
People are like, you know, hey, you know, we're bringing in, you know, these musicians for this event. I'm like, why aren't you being local? Why aren't you getting the blues musicians in your town to play? Like, it's one thing if you have like 12 people in your town, then sure, I get it. There's probably only one person who plays that kind of music, if any. But if you live in a decent sized town, you have blues bands, you have people who play most of the like foundational styles of music that have any kind of popularity in the United States. You don't have to be in a major metropolitan city to get that.
One of our most favorite local blues musicians, who we wanted to play tonight at the festival, is at another subculture blues event across the country. And I was like, what? why are you guys taking our guy? Like, why get your own musicians? Like, this is supposed to be our local festival where people come to see what our community culture is, and this is one of the most significant people that we connect with in this way, and now they don't get to be a part of it because they had to fly across the country to do a gig for some other town. It's very strange to me. But the stuff you were saying about the communities in Europe all the time, I get really confused by why people want to, like, they'll take a couple blues classes and then they'll start teaching blues because it's not their culture or their cultural dance. They don't know the movement, they don't understand the music, they don't know the difference between this and that. They start teaching it. In the process of teaching it, they change it significantly. And I'm always wondering, like, why don't you go do your own cultural dance? Like, why? I don't know.
Well, definitely in some cases it's because blues is, you know, American, and, you know, the cultural imperialism of America, you know, is pretty pervasive around the world. Like, I talk to people, and using the term talk in a very broad sense, on the internet who say this is blues music and that is blues music, and I'm like, but it's not. Like, that thing right there is not blues music. And I'm like, well, it's slow, it's emotionally evocative, it's got like a backbeat, and I'm like, okay, that's great. I can think of every genre ever that has some music that fits into that category. But I know that if I go to Singapore and I'm like, you guys have any place I can go and hear music that's like, da 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 da. They're like, oh yeah, the blues. Here's where you go. It's the idea that riff is just so popular that people who live in a place and have never been to the United States and have never had a U.S. blues band travel to their country and play know that, and they have people in their city who play that kind of music. It's fascinating, and I think part of that draw is it's American.
But then it's there. It is that, like, every country I go to, people are dancing in these little ballrooms and things, and I'm trying to show them how to, do these things and about the music. And then I will go to 5 different bars and dance, and I'll be, oh, you guys have like a great blues music scene.
And they have no idea what you're talking about.
If you would go and dance to it, then you would actually learn the movements from the musicians in the way that it's traditionally learned. You listen to the music, your body responds, and the movements will develop more naturally, rather than you trying to recreate it in this hall you've rented with this recorded music that isn't even necessarily blues, picking up some moves off of YouTube. And then, like you said, it's like this, I want to do it my exact way, but then I want to call it this cultural dance. I don't teach French, folk dances or, Scottish folk dances, and like claim to do them. So that's always kind of the confusing part, like why?
So Richard, what's your take on what they're talking about? I mean, would you go as far as to say that there is a sort of cultural imperialism, or what do you think is happening with the technology?
Well, I completely agreed with everything Damon said, but I wouldn't use the word cultural imperialism for this reason. That gives the impression that America is forcing this culture, and when I'm there, it feels like almost the opposite. It feels like these kids feel like renegades, that I like this stuff. It's me. It doesn't feel like for me, imperialism says, we have the power, we are going to make you do this. I think the kids are feeling they're discovering this themselves. And they love it, this American quality to it, despite how a horrible reputation U.S. now has. They still love this music. So I'm agreeing with you. It's just I wouldn't use the word imperialism, that's all. It was more like, as you mentioned, the love of it, this passion they feel that speaks to them as an individual.
And what is it? You said the American quality. What if you just had to?
I've been teaching a lot in Russia. I've been going over to Russia 3 times every year, and I see this love of things American. Right next to the studio is this Route 66 museum in St. Petersburg. Anything Americana, and I think it speaks to what they don't have. There's this wish fulfillment. I would say 9 out of 10 t-shirts I see in Moscow are in English and slang, American slang, not British English. And I've not analyzed exactly why, but it feels individualistic and it feels passionate. And very contrary to a rather disgusting image the U.S. is now presenting to the world. Sorry to be political, but this thing I'm talking about overrides that. If that makes any sense.
I had chosen the term imperialism, thinking about how the concept of Americanism was delivered originally to a lot of these places. So, you know, we have Europe, where they really started getting into American things after, well, the first part was World War I, but significantly after World War II. You know, Russia, it was the, you know, the anti-Soviet, we were the, you know, the antithesis to that. And so when they wanted to rebel against their, you know, the structures and restrictions of their own government, you know, we were broadcasting, you know, Free America radio into that country. And so they were able to turn on their radio and hear our music. You know, you have examples of that throughout Asia. You know, it's that first taste, I think, in a lot of ways was not them reaching out to find something of us, and it was us inserting ourselves into their country in some fashion. And, you know, like Western Europe, in a very like positive way, but still by a means of force. That created, you know, a positive association, like, oh, you know, Nazis are bad. We don't like Nazis. America is coming and helping get rid of the Nazis who have, you know, conquered our country, or who have, you know, inserted themselves into our government. In the case of, you know, Italian and French fascism, and so, you know, America's presence at that time in that place was a very positive thing, but it was still a case of us going in with a force to get rid of a bad element.
So I hear you talking about like this almost cultural messaging that could be maybe inseparable from at least the culture of movements, or maybe even the movements themselves. I guess I'm curious. Do you think they're separable? And this is a question for all of you. When these dance forms in various forms, right? We're here at this blues weekend, but in all the different forms, because we could look at, you know, tango or waltz, or even I would say folk dances from around the world. When these styles of movement, the actual movement of bodies move, is this separable or inseparable from the messaging and the history and the stories that are, to me, in some sense, seem inherent, but I'm not sure how do you all view that? What do you see happening? What are your understandings of that relationship?
Well, people who are trying to do the dances without that knowledge are not able to accomplish it. I very rarely, I can't think of an example of somebody who is really accurately doing a dance without understanding the culture. Even in some place like Korea, it looks like a caricature. It looks like they're acting or making fun of. There is a lack of real authenticity. As like from a movement education perspective, they're able to identify the movement elements and mimic them, but they aren't able to mimic the spirit and the energy and the feeling with which the dances are done.
And you're saying that spirit, energy, feeling informs or defines even the physical movements.
Exactly.
I would definitely say define, not even inform. Like the things that we think about when we think of a particular kind of dance or dance genre, the physicality behind it is attached directly to the music. Like the shape of tango. You know, if you take, you know, a 30-second clip, or you take a minute-long dance and you break it into 6 still frames, and you look at it like, okay, yeah, that clearly has a shape. And if you've ever seen tango, you can take any tango dancer and get a minute of their dancing and break it into 6 still shots and go, they're doing tango. You can do that with Latin, you can do that with swing, you should be able to do that with hip hop and blues and, you know, waltz. There is a specific shape. That shape that is based on the aesthetic An aesthetic may be a very well examined thing, depending on where the dance comes from and how the dance is currently being transmitted, or it may not be a very well articulated thing, and it may be sort of a feel that everybody who really does it gets it.
I think of the Crumpers,
Yeah,
like from
exactly.
Rise, and they're like, they say, if you're not there every single day,
Yeah,
we're
You can
moving.
Yeah, you can tell when the specific, quote from that is something along the lines like, yeah, we can tell if you haven't been to, to a session in a week, 2 weeks, because your dancing doesn't look like our dancing anymore. That it changes every day, every session, something new is, being developed within that. And that comes from, cultural transmission. And if you are not part of that culture, if you're not in it, you don't understand the cultural values that shape those artistic decisions. Like Brenda said, you end up mimicking a thing, and it looks more like a caricature because, I take, I take 6 still shots of Frankie Manning, and now I have this image in my head of what Lindy Hop is supposed to look like, and so I'm going to make my body do those 6 shapes. But how I transition between those shapes, how I move within that shape is just different.
That's what we call critical timing in the competition judging.
Yeah.
How we move in between, right? And that's why you get a lot of people coming and dancing in blues competitions, and you're like, oh, that's not quite blues. And they're like, what do you mean? Well, because the critical timing doesn't express the dance in between the shapes you made. All you did was accent and pose. You didn't actually dance the dance.
Yeah.
One thing that fascinates me about these different shapes in the snapshots is we're occasionally now seeing hybrid forms that might combine 2 or 3. And they are authentic in a sense in that they've created something new. Like this morning we'll be teaching this French mazurka, some people call it mazurka clandestina. And I've been watching it evolve. I go there every year from this mazurka, but now I see the shape of tango in it and the blues. And it is its own thing. It doesn't really have a feeling of mimicking, but to see this hybrid of these shapes that have fused into something new is fascinating in our merging, hybridizing dance world that we live in. It fascinates me.
Absolutely. You can see examples of that, I think, in any, what I call living tradition. Like, here is a thing that started in a particular point, and it was the thing for a group of people at a specific point in time. And it got enough social cash to go beyond the high school for the graduating class of 1952. So that the graduating class of 1956 is doing that dance, but the music has not held still. The music has continued to change and morph. And even if we're looking at it staying within the same genre, you have those new developments. And then another generation of dancers, and I don't mean like parent to child, but I started dancing, and then my younger sister, got, to the point where she was old enough to get into a club. I'm like, hey, come to my favorite place, and now she's picking up the stuff that's being done in that place, and then she passes it on to a friend, and so like dancer generation by that level. The new generation has different ideas that they bring with them. And so these dances can evolve. And if the music does start to change and starts to create new subgenres and then even cross from a subgenre into its own separate genre, that dancing, if it is popular enough, will make that transition also. And sometimes it will hang on to the same name. Slow drag is an excellent example. I mean, we're talking 1880s, 1890s, but the Alphas, a Black Greek fraternal organization, have what they call the slow drag, and it is absolutely the same movements now being used to interpret, slow jams like R&B and contemporary R&B and slow hip hop and hip hop infused pop music, that kind of stuff. And you look at it and you look at the older examples of it, and you're like, yeah, actually that thing that you're doing totally makes sense, because the Alphas come from this particular historically Black college, and in that particular town is a moment where this dance is being done in a very popular way amongst Black people. And so the idea that like a fraternal organization may embrace it and hold it as one of their like cultural touchstones, and it's a living tradition. You show up and you see all these people doing this thing in a similar way, even though they don't have their own personal style, but it's influenced by everything that has come to that person before they learned that particular dance. So if you're really into hip hop, you have a different way of carrying yourself, a different way of pulsing and resonating and moving and grooving to the music. But there's still like this concept but this dance involves this step, and too much change creates a new thing. And it's not considered bad, it's just considered new.
So about this idea of like identity, I'm specifically thinking of like more gang-related street dances like crip walking, or the old stories from like Marshall Stern's book about Al learning these dances and jumping in the circle, and in some sense knowing that he was jumping into a circle of gangbangers, and he was identifying in a way that was like a risk. Like you couldn't just jump into the circle, that you can't just, right, I'm not from that culture, I haven't grown with it, but from what I understand, you can't just do the certain movements because people will know and they will see it, and in a gang culture there would be pretty dramatic repercussions. What do you think about identification through specific movements like that?
I think that there is, it's hard to say, because the concepts of like gangs being all about violence and hating people who are not them, a lot of that is really Hollywood based. Like I had family members who were Crips, and I had family members who were Bloods, and we would be at a family reunion and there's nothing going on. They're family. They just come from different parts of town, and if you live in this rough neighborhood, being a member of this gang keeps you safe, and not like protection style, like join our gang or we're gonna beat you up. It's if I don't have a group of people at my back, then I have to fight every day, and I have to fight against everyone who may be looking out for me. But if I identify with this group and they have my back, then no one else is going to mess with me, because I have a crew. And that's not to say that there isn't a huge amount of violence within those subcultures, because there certainly is. But in a lot of ways, it's not the thing that Hollywood makes it out to be. The idea that if you are not a Crip and you show up to a party and there is a corner where people are doing the sea walk, they're much more concerned about whether or not you're representing well than whether or not you're fronting on them. If you are trying to claim their set and you're not actually a Crip, like if you can do the dance really well, you'll get your props. If you can't, then they might say like, you can't do this, you need to leave. But that is as much about respect as it is about ownership of a thing.
Earlier we were talking about blues and the living blues, and one thing that I've noticed is that the people around the world in the subculture for blues, what they call blues, they are doing a lot of reenactment. So they'll take a dance that they learned from somebody from a certain time period. Because remember you were saying the high school thing, that like this year is doing the dance different than this year. So I'm dancing, at least 6 nights a week in local blues bars, and often dancing in blues bars around the world. And I haven't found huge variations in what's happening in the blues bars all over the world. Actually, the contemporary blues that's being played in bars now, it has some variation, but it's pretty similarly progressing.
Sure.
And we have huge blues festivals, live music blues festivals, and so there's acts traveling around and being at these festivals, and so that subculture is very well connected, or that mainstream culture actually.
Yeah.
That's not the subculture, it's the mainstream culture is very well connected, and they are all continuing to do their thing. And then I'm dancing to that and continuing to teach and inform other people from that place. But then I go into communities. This has happened many times where I come in and I start to show a thing, and somebody from Australia or Spain will say, "That's not blues."
Yeah, I get that.
I got that in Israel.
Yeah. Or somebody you could teach something, and then go back a year later, and somebody will say, well, that's not wrong, because they've taken one bit of it and formalized it and made it, compartmentalized it into, it's this one thing, which gets narrower and narrower.
Yeah.
Relating to something you said, in historic dance, we sometimes recreate dances from dance manuals, like the 20s blues. And these are like a bridge. They take something from this, and the dance book is the bridge, and then it grows from here. And I think teachers, or even YouTube, or that kind of a thing. And it feels so different when I was talking about the mazurka. These are people just go out dancing. And when they go out dancing, they also do salsa. They also do tango. They're not consciously trying to mimic or do anything. It's just, if you know 3 dance forms, you put them together, and it's like being you.
Yeah,
and not
absolutely.
trying to pretend to be a style. I don't even think they were realizing they were putting salsa moves into their mazurka. It was just, it felt like it was almost a naive, that's not quite the right word, but it's an innocent being yourself, as opposed to trying to be something else.
Yeah, there are a lot of nice communities like this around the world, and that's when I see the communities that are trying, I'll often think, why can't you just do the thing you're doing, appreciate it and enjoy it? I mean, I see a lot of these online arguments, right? We're arguing about language online, and it would be so simple if people just embraced what they're doing, really felt proud of it, give it a name or don't. But why do people have to try to create value with it by taking other names?
Yeah.
That's the part that I love this. I love, I'll point it out to people when I go to Europe. I'm like, yes, what you're doing is not blues, and that's not a criticism. When I say that's not blues, it is in no way a criticism. It's like, what you're doing is beautiful. You're a beautiful dancer. I mean, I had people crying after competition. Brenda said my dancing isn't blues. It's like, your dancing is lovely, wonderful, gorgeous.
Own the thing that you do. Stop trying to make blues or any specific dance be the thing you want it to be. Like, if you like what you do, chances, and you do it moderately well, like not great, but just moderately well, other people are going to see it, and they're also going to like it, and you will create your own dance style. And heaven forbid, if you do what you do really well, you will absolutely create your own dance style. Like, stop trying to co-opt or appropriate or associate the thing that you do with this other thing if it's outside of that. Just be proud of your accomplishments and stand up and say, this is what I do. This is Damon style. Like, I'll teach it to you if you think it's cool too. And then just go with it. I started laughing when you were making your statement, Richard, about the mazurka, specifically the French mazurka, because the idea of, well, I do these different dances and a song comes on and I want to dance to it, and then I'm going to do the things that feel good and make sense to the music, and I'm not going to really worry about whether what I'm doing is technically salsa or technically tango or technically mazurka. I'm just going to dance the way my body knows how to move to music that moves me.
Exactly.
That's what we call dancing. Like literally, that is how these things got started, and it's what all of the originators and innovators in all of these historically founded dances did. You can see elements of tango in Lindy Hop performances, and I don't mean from whatever Lindy Hop event was last weekend. I mean from performances by Whitey's Lindy Hoppers that we have on film. You get these things that were entirely inspired by something else that they've been exposed to. Frankie Manning talks about how, the bands and we're talking like the big kings of swing, Basie and Ellington and Goodman and stuff. They all played waltzes and foxtrots as well as, capital S swing songs, but they also played, barrel house blues. They played, they were dance bands. If you couldn't play what the dancers wanted to hear, you didn't eat that week, right? Your tour just collapsed. Like you were expected to be able to play, and if you couldn't, then they would get other people up. Like W.C. Handy has a thing in his autobiography where he talks about having played, I can't remember which southern city it's in now, but his band was playing and someone had asked about a certain kind of music, and he says we don't do that. And so their set was over and local musicians got up and started playing that music. And he equates that to one of the first times that he himself really heard the blues. That idea that somehow the thing that you were doing by combining these different dances is new, that to me is naive. That is just a very human reaction to knowledge. If I have studied math and I have studied science and I have studied art, those are all going to inform themselves because they're all part of my knowledge set. This idea of compartmentalizing and creating these arbitrary divisions is weird to me.
So what? Yeah, we just have a few minutes left, so I'm curious as we're kind of moving forward, because the three of you are really interesting because you're going into these local communities and you're traveling the world, and what is the role of, or what do you see as the role of a modern educator who is in this connected world of media and these hyper local scenes and the various movements? How do you look at it? What is important to you? What do you think is important as you and these dance forms and communities move forward?
That's why I've chosen movement education as opposed to focusing on subculture dances. I'm focused on movement-based lifestyle and sensual living because I believe that a lot of the people, a huge percentage of the people coming in, they are looking for touch, they are looking for community, they're looking for belonging. Those reasons in a lot of the big cities that I teach in are overriding what dance it is. If somebody wants to learn a specific dance and I know it, I'll be happy to show it to them. But I find that if I can show people how to connect with their own body and how to connect with each other, and they can choose any music that they want to, any venue that they want to, any people they want to, and they'll be able to do that creation of their own style, and they don't have to, either they might be authentically recreating something that existed before, because they really listened to the music and it moved them in the same way. I mean, I see this right now in Kizomba. The way that people dance Kizomba in Angola is exactly the way that I dance 1920s blues. It's the steps are identical and the movement in the body is identical. And it's so cool to see oh, okay, this came from Africa to America at this time, and not that long later, we have some evidence of it. I've studied that, and now this has continued to go on in Africa, and now these young people have picked it up, and it's the same dance. But then that dance is evolving in a new way that's in a different direction than what is evolving here in America. But people once they just can connect with their body, learn how to hear the music, let it hit them, move how they want to move, connect with other people, and we don't need to worry about what it is, what it's called, what's right, what's wrong. We get to what we all really want, which is to connect and feel, belong.
How about you two? What do you?
Well, you're talking about as academic traveling around the world. I mostly am watching and listening. I've been a dance historian for 40 years, 42. Therefore, I probably know less for sure than anybody else here. And the more I learn, the less I know for sure. So I'm still mostly just watching, and what can I still learn?
Yeah, I think of I come at it from a different standpoint. Like I use the tools and methodology of academia as best as I can. But to me, what I'm trying to do is keep the spirit, the style, if we will, of the dancing that I learned from people who are mostly not with us anymore, alive. And for me, it's not, I don't want it to be a recreation of this exact dance as I learned it from, my great Aunt Mary. Like, that's not what, I'm about. It's like, I'm going to teach you the structure that these people taught me, and I'm hoping that it won't be a recreation of that thing, that it will be part of a living tradition, which is to say that I'm going to use this knowledge as a base, as a kernel of which I'm going to develop things based on my own dance background, my own movement styles, the music that I love to listen to, and carry it forward. So I try to explain, like, there are, innumerable ways of doing a dance right. There are a few ways of very clearly doing a dance wrong. And doing a dance wrong doesn't mean that you're dancing poorly. It means that it's not that dance. And teaching like idiomatic blues dances, like, okay, this dance is done this way. There's a dance almost just like it that inverts the rhythm, or that uses hips as the primary means of expressing that baseline rhythm rather than the chest. And that's the only difference. So, but they come from different places and different times. So if you want to do this thing, then you really need moving your hips more as your primary thing. But that means, I'm not telling you to not do that chest thing. I'm saying is do that chest thing, but recognize that that's just a different dance. And the idea that if I can go, here is sort of like the foundational elements of this dance or foundational elements of that dance. And as long as I sort of stay true to those foundational elements, I can grow it and change it and add things in all sorts of ways. And it's that thing. And when I choose to depart, I'm making that choice and I'm creating something new. And that creating something new is, to me, the important part, because that keeps the tradition of dancing, alive. And that's ultimately what I think is the most important thing for myself.
Great. Well, we're about out of time, so I want to thank you, Richard, Brenda, Damon, for joining us here in Portland, Oregon.
Thank you.
Of course. We're sitting in Brenda Russell's studio, Dance Mode Studio in Southeast Portland, and these folk are all off to teach classes today, I believe, at Rose City Blues. So, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was fascinating.
Super.